with all those announcements, I would like to introduce our speaker, Jim Danzenbaker. Jim has been giving Shorebird workshops in different parts of the country, such as San Diego, the Rio Grande Valley in Texas, and Ocean Shores, Washington. And he's going to talk to us today all about shorebird identification.
Let's start. We got a lot to cover today. So first of all, I wanted to thank Vancouver Audubon and Don Rose and you, Sam, for that introduction and in allowing me to talk about the shorebirds of Clark County. And I also want to thank Vancouver Audubon in advance for all of your conservation and environmental initiatives and your outreach programs to promote birding and bird watching in the Vancouver area and Clark County in general. So thank you very much for that. Two words about me. I'm not a professor of any kind. I'm not a biologist. I just really like birds and also shorebirds. So I'm really thrilled to have this opportunity to talk about the shorebirds of Clark County. So let's start. So the goals of today and what I'd like to be able to teach you folks is which shorebird species are regularly occurring in Clark County, where to look for shorebirds using the eBird app. And I'm hoping that everybody has some sort of passing knowledge about eBird and hopefully has used it extensively. And then we'll go into identification of species using different aspects of plumage and also behavior. So those are the three things that we're going to get out of this. So let's start off by saying, okay, in all of the world, there are about more or less 200 species of shorebirds, which sounds like a really daunting thing to be able to try to figure out, 200 different species of shorebirds. But when you pare it down, there's 83 species in North America, 37 in Washington. And then when you get down to Clark County, there's only about 28, and that's probably a little bit more than are regularly occurring in Clark County. So you've already gone from 200 down to 28. So the task is not as daunting as you would originally think. One of the first things to do when you're looking at shorebirds is trying to figure out what species should be in Clark County at any given time. And this is where eBird comes into play. This particular slide is showing the bar charts for shorebirds occurring in Clark County. And in order to get to this, you go to launch eBird via the Northwest eBird Northwest portal, go into Explore, and then select Clark County, and then select bar charts, and then tab down to where the shorebirds start. And you can see that by month, it'll give you a graphic illustration of birds that are the commonest, then less common based on how wide the little spaces are within each row for each individual shorebird. So that's a really, really good way to be able to learn what to expect as far as shorebirds occurring in Clark County when you go out. Now, another interesting thing that eBird can do for you is, when you look at, for example, Lee's sandpiper, which is a bird that occurs in many, many months of the year, and you want to learn more about, okay, what are my chances of seeing that? How many am I going to see out there? What are the frequency of, how many times am I actually going to be able to run into a Lee's sandpiper, for example? eBird allows you to do that by selecting the little jagged line square that's to the right of the particular species that you're interested in. And when you're doing that, you get to this particular frame. This is frequency, which means the amount of the percentage of times that you go out into the field, how many times are you actually going to run into that particular species that you're interested in seeing. And you can see that during the fall migration period and also spring migration, that's where your peak opportunities are for finding Lee's sandpiper. And they drop down considerably from May 15th to June 15th, when there's hardly any, because that's because they've all made it all the way up to the Arctic where they're breeding. And then late fall into winter, November and December, you're less likely to see it. Another chart is you can look at the average count that people have. So 30 and 28. So this shows that, during those peak periods of percentage chance of actually seeing a least sandpiper, you're going to see quite a few of them when you go out. And so these charts are really, really important in providing you information as far as your ability to know what to expect when you go out in the field looking for shorebirds. So since you were not able to read the individual species that were on those charts, they're listed here: greater and lesser yellowlegs, solitary sandpiper, spotted, both species of dowitchers, stilt sandpiper, which is actually rare in Clark County, pectoral and sharp-tailed sandpiper. Sharp-tailed sandpiper is also rare. And all three species of phalaropes occur in Clark County. And we'll get into more information on each one of these species later on. You have the smaller shorebirds, for example, least western semi-palmated and bared sandpipers, which are called the peeps because they're really, really small. Dunlin and also sanderling, which is a rare bird in Clark County as well, but we'll cover it anyway. These are typically the species that people tend to run away from because they are a bit confusing when you see them out in the field. So we'll cover those a little bit more than the others. We've got large, long-legged shorebirds like black-necked stilt, which thankfully is fairly obvious. American avocet as well as fairly obvious. Whimbrel and long-billed curlew are also what I would consider long-legged shorebirds, but they're pretty rare in Clark County, but we'll take a cursory look at them anyway. And another family of shorebirds are the plovers, which are killdeer, semi-palmated plover, black-bellied plover, and golden plovers, which includes American and Pacific golden plovers. Both of the golden plovers, however, are quite rare in Clark County. So most of the plovers you'll get are killdeer, semi-palmated, and black-bellied. So those are the species that we'll be looking at during this presentation. So where do you go to look for shorebirds? This map is a screen print from eBird showing all the hot spots in Clark County. And what I've done is there's little arrows that point to spots in Clark County that tend to have a concentration of shorebirds. For example, the end of Lower River Road, which is north and west of Vancouver Lake, tends to be a really, really good spot. Assuming that there is a good amount of water. For example, this year with the drought that we were having, a lot of these places were completely bone dry. So finding shorebirds was a little bit more difficult because you had to find the water as well as mud. So that's the end of Lower River Road. And there's a photo of a flock of shorebirds at the end of Lower River Road this spring. Shillapoo Lake, which I think is one of my favorite places to go look for shorebirds because it seems like there's always water there. That's also just slightly north and west of Vancouver Lake, but it's absolutely a beautiful situation where there's 3 or 4 different lakes there. And when the water level is dropping, there's quite a bit of exposed mud, which attracts, or at least is good habitat for shorebirds to come in. Ridgefield National Wildlife Refuge, of course, is always good. And in spring, with the spring rains, it tends to really get a lot of good mud flat there, as opposed to later on in the summer when everything is bone dry. So especially this spring, earlier this spring, there was a pretty good amount of water, and this photo was taken just opposite from the Kewah Trail, where there were quite a good selection of shorebirds that were showing up. The Port of Vancouver Pond, which is on northwest Lower River Road, which is south of Vancouver Lake, is also good, but you have to time your visit right for when the water level is really receding and there's lots of mud flats. I've had times when there's 300 or 400 individual shorebirds just on the one lake. So that's always a good spot to check for shorebirds when the water level is right. If you are wanting to go further afield into Oregon to do birding, there are a variety of different places for shorebirds. There's Salvie Island, which is just due west of Vancouver Lake. There's Force Lake and Smith and Bybee, which is only a couple of miles west or a couple of miles south after you get into Oregon on I-5. There's also Broughton Beach, which is just across the way from the Vancouver, the port, and I'm sorry, it's right next to Portland International Airport. And that's a spot that is really good and productive for different kinds of shorebirds to show up. Also, if you want to stay really, really close to home, you just go and find your own neighborhood water retention pond, because those can actually be fairly productive for shorebirds. For example, the spring, the photo is one of the water retention ponds in the north side of Battleground, where solitary sandpiper, greater yellowlegs, and Wilson snipe, among other shorebirds, showed up this spring. And these water retention ponds are, as the arrows indicate, they are absolutely all over the place. And just regularly visiting these water retention ponds, you never know what's going to show up. So really good spot to be able to look for birds. So let's get into the what do you look at when you're looking at a shorebird to try to figure out what in the heck you're looking at. So some of the things that you're going to be looking for when you're looking at a shorebird is study the profile. The size, is it large, medium, or small? The habitat that it's in, the behavior, and the color. And we'll expound on each one of these in the next few slides. So when I'm talking about profile, I'm talking about, what's the length of the bill? So look at the length of the bill, the leg length as well. For example, a dowitcher has long legs, as does avocet and greater yellowlegs. Head shape, is it round or flat? And also body length. Body length differs considerably in shorebirds, and that gives you a good indication of what species of birds that you're looking at. And again, the size of the shorebird. Are they large, like a marble godwit or a black-necked stilt? Are they medium-sized, like the pectoral sandpiper in the lower left, or Lee's sandpiper, which is the smallest of the shorebirds that we have, that's only 6 inches long? What's the habitat that those shorebirds are in? And you have, mud flats. There are particular shorebirds that will like to feed on the mud flats. Deeper water, like this dowitcher. Flooded fields, which is a great way to find shorebirds in spring. And then also in heavier vegetation, like these snipe that are cruising around on the edge of the vegetation, the heavier vegetation. That'll give you an idea of what you may be looking at just based on the vegetation that they're feeding in. And then also the behavior of the bird that you're looking at. Are they walking, or are they running? Are they probing or stabbing? Like dowitchers, they do a lot of stabbing into the water because they've got the longer bill. They're able to probe much further down than a lot of other shorebirds. Are they going back and forth like those avocets in the lower center? And are they whirling around like phalaropes do? When they whirl around and almost looks like they're creating a whirlpool. So the behavior of the shorebird is a good indication of a way to separate that shorebird from other shorebirds just by their feeding style. Okay, and the color. Are they gray? Are they brown, black, white? Do they have yellow legs? What color or combination of colors is the bill? I tend to be a bill and leg man, I can say, for shorebirds. The bill of a bird can tell you a lot about what the bird is, whether it's long, short, narrow, wide-based, is it curved, those kinds of things. And then also what color of is the bill. So those are things that you look for when you're looking at shorebirds. All of those different types of things will get you much closer to being able to identify the bird just based on those features. So now we'll go into species specific. And the first grouping is sandpipers, which is the largest grouping, and includes willets and yellowlegs, spotted, solitary, and stilt sandpipers, dowitchers, and snipe, medium-sized shorebirds, and then also sanderling, dunlin, and peeps. So put your seatbelts on, because we'll try to get through all of these in the amount of time that we have. So yellowlegs, I think everybody's familiar with yellowlegs. The problem is that there are greater and lesser yellowlegs. But to identify a yellowlegs, they have the long, thin bill. They've got really long, thin legs, yellow legs. They're very delicate looking, very, very thin. Even greater yellowlegs look thin. And they tend to be grayer. as opposed to brown. So look for those grayer birds that are standing on very long yellow legs. So how do you tell the difference between a greater and a lesser yellow legs? Well, the best way to do it is look at those bills. So in the upper right photo, you'll see a greater yellow legs next to a lesser yellow legs. And you'll notice a few of the things with the bill. The greater yellow legs, the bill length is twice the length of the head. And with a lesser yellow legs, the bill length is approximately the length of the head. So that's a sizable difference in length of bill between greater and lesser yellow legs. Notice also the base of the bill, how with a greater yellow legs, the left bird, it's wider at the base, whereas the bill on the lesser yellow legs is the same width of bill throughout. Even at the base, it's still that needle thin but fairly short bill. Also look at obviously the body size. I believe greater yellow legs is about something like 16 inches long or 14 inches, and lesser yellow legs only 10 inches. So there's a considerable difference in bill length as well as body length of greater and lesser yellow legs. Both of them have the same yellow legs, so you can't really separate them from that. But just get a look at the bill and the size of the bird to determine whether it's a greater or a lesser yellow legs. And that holds true even when you're only looking at one yellow legs all by itself. Go for that bill. If it's wider at the base, it's probably a greater yellow legs. So the next bird on the agenda is solitary sandpiper. The solitary sandpiper is one of those longer-legged shorebirds that's very similar in looks to a lesser yellow legs, but they've got greenish legs. And it's still a medium length, thin, straight bill, much like a lesser yellow legs. And they've got a white eye ring, which is unique to solitary sandpiper of the larger shorebirds. Lesser yellow legs does not have a white eye ring. They've got a barred outer tail, which is something that's really good to notice when you're trying to separate a solitary from a lesser yellow legs. And also it bobs its tail. So let's look at the lesser yellow legs versus solitary sandpiper. So lesser yellow legs has the yellow legs. Solitary has greenish. Barred outer tail for a solitary sandpiper and bobs the tail. Lesser yellow legs is not going to bob the tail, and lesser yellow legs does not have a barred outer tail either. You've got the white eye ring with white lores on the solitary sandpiper, which you're really not going to get on the lesser yellow legs. So those are some of the features to look for. Solitary sandpiper also is a bit more of a retiring species. It'll be off by itself in some little pond somewhere. For example, when I mentioned the retention ponds, solitary sandpipers seem to love these little retention ponds in spring, especially. In the last couple of years, I've found solitary sandpiper at 4 different locations in Battleground, and each one of them is in a water retention pond. So if you want to look for solitary sandpiper in spring, go to your nearest water retention pond, because that seems to really be a good attractant for them. Lesser yellow legs, they can be more out in the open, especially when they're with greater yellow legs. Of course, that's all a general statement. You can easily have lesser yellow legs in a retention pond and solitary sandpiper out in the open as well, but they just tend to, the solitaries prefer those little more quiet places. Spotted sandpiper, on the other hand, and the only reason I put this in now is because they bob the tail very much like a solitary sandpiper, but they're sort of dumpy looking. They're sort of a fat looking shorebird with fairly short bill, fairly short legs. And they've also got a short, very kind of thick throughout the length of the bill compared to solitary and lesser yellow legs that we were talking about earlier. They've also, when they're flying, they've got a distinctive stiff winged flight. They can flap their wings very, very fast, maybe 4 or 5 times, and then glide a little bit, and then 4 or 5 times a very stiff wing beat. Again, it's very distinctive amongst all the shorebirds, the flight style of spotted sandpiper. So again, spotted versus solitary, fairly long greenish legs for the solitary versus fairly short pale legs for spotted. Thin bill versus very thick bill, and long body versus sort of a I'll call it a heavy body as opposed to a dumpy body. And both of them bob the tail. Okay, let's talk about dowitchers. And there are two types of dowitchers, but we'll just go with dowitcher at this point. Dowitchers are fairly large birds. They have medium length legs, which are sort of greenish yellow legs. Long, very thick, straight bill. It's pretty much unique in all of the regularly occurring shorebirds that are here in Clark County. If you see shorebirds that have that really long, thick bill, they're going to be dowitchers unless you happen to be looking at a snipe, and we'll compare those two later on. They have a probing feeding style because they've got that long bill. They're able to reach down further into the mud, so they're able to probe down much further than other shorebirds that are out here. They've got a very horizontal stance as opposed to being very upright. And they're often seen in flocks. Sometimes you can see maybe 40 or 50 at some of the locations that I mentioned earlier on in the talk. I believe this fall, I had something like 125 dowitchers at the Northwest Lower River Road pond, which was absolutely wonderful to see that many dowitchers in one place. And then you have to search through them, see if there's anything different in them. So more on dowitchers. This is short-billed dowitcher here, and a lot of I would say probably 99% of the dowitchers that we get in Clark County are long-billed versus short-billed. But short-billed do occur here, and it's just one of those birds to sort of look for when you're out there, when you're seeing a large flock of shorebird or large flock of dowitchers. And the bill does average shorter and thicker than long-billed, but for the life of me, that is extremely difficult to be able to see. One of the things that you would want to do is look at the complex internal markings on the tertials and coverts on a dowitcher to determine whether it's short-billed or long-billed. Typically, short-billed dowitchers are coastal. They're actually more of a saltwater species, and long-billed dowitchers are more of a freshwater species, which is one of the reasons why we only get long-billed out here and just the occasional short-billed. Short-billed dowitcher also has a distinctive choo-choo-choo call, as opposed to a pick, pick, pick kind of call. So they can be most easily separated just by the call notes that they're giving. And here's long-billed and short-billed dowitchers, just a comparison. The long-billed averages a taller crown. In other words, they stand a little further upright, and the tertials are different. There's not as complex inner markings on the wings on a long-billed dowitcher compared to short-billed. And the call of a long-billed dowitcher is the single pip, pip, pip. Okay, I think we just covered everything that's in there. But when you're looking at dowitchers, just listen for the choo-choo-choo as opposed to the high pip call, and that'll indicate that there's possibly a short-billed dowitcher in there. Okay, stilt sandpiper. I just threw stilt sandpiper in because there are a couple of records for stilt sandpiper in Clark County. They're by no means common. They're by no means seen every single year. I think I've only seen one in the 16 years that I've been here. But they do occur west of the Cascades, so it's a bird that's sort of to be expected down here. It is a medium-sized shorebird with those greenish yellow legs. It's got an eye line, and it's sort of that off-white below. It's not a pristine white below. It's got a slightly drooped bill, and it's got a very sewing machine-like feeding style, even more so than a dowitcher. When I grew up, I know everybody out here says that dowitchers have a sewing machine style of feeding, but the way that my father taught me stilt sandpiper is, he said that's the one that does the sewing machine feeding, even more so than a dowitcher. And it's got a very angular head when it's feeding. It's very 90-degree kind of thing when it's feeding, and it's very easy to for me it's very easy to pick out amongst dowitchers. And usually when there's a stilt sandpiper around, it's with a flock of dowitchers. So it's something to always be on the lookout for. If you happen to see a bird in a dowitcher flock that's slightly smaller, doesn't have the long, straight, thick bill, and it has a bill that's slightly drooped. So there's the comparison of those two. See the curved bill as opposed to the long, straight bill of the dowitcher. the leg color on both of those species is pretty much the same. And it's amazing how similar stilt sandpiper is to lesser yellowlegs. And the difference being the intensity of the yellow on the lesser yellowlegs versus the yellowish green on stilt sandpiper, and also the eye line on stilt sandpiper as opposed to not really an eye line on the lesser yellowlegs at all. Lesser yellowlegs has a thinner, very, very straight bill as opposed to a slight curve on the stilt sandpiper. I think everybody is familiar with Wilson snipe. It's one of my favorite shorebirds because it's such a striking bird. They always have that sort of that Hunchback of Notre Dame look as they're walking around in the vegetation, probing the earth for whatever food they're getting. They've got a very horizontal stance and striped head and back, which separates them immediately from dowitchers, which are the only other shorebird in our area that has that long, straight, heavy bill. And there's that comparison of dowitcher and long-billed dowitcher and the snipe. Just look for those stripes on the back and that very, very hunched look. And also the markings on the undersides are completely different as well. And you're not going to get snipe that are occurring in flocks of 100 that are feeding close together like long-billed dowitchers would. And the snipe tend to be on the edges of the grasses, probing around just on the edge of the vegetation, whereas the dowitchers often are right out in the middle of the ponds, feeding in fairly deep water as well as on the mudflats. So let's go on to another set of shorebirds here. This is the pectoral sandpiper. This is also one of my favorite birds. It's a medium-sized shorebird, and we get them mostly in the fall migration. Couple of weeks ago when the rains first hit and the water started piling up in some of the muddy areas at Ridgefield National Wildlife Refuge, we actually had 50 pectoral sandpipers in one pond, which was an incredible sight to see. But they've got a short, thick bill. They've got yellow legs, very, very yellow legs, and they're brown plumage throughout, as opposed to the gray plumage and the other colors that we've seen with the other shorebirds. And notice the breast. It's sharply demarcated, the heavy streaking on the upper breast to the belly, which is that white color. So that's a really easy way to pick these out if you're just looking at the front of them. Yellow legs, fairly short, thick bill, with the heavy demarcation of the streaks above, up the upper breast and throat area down to the lower belly that's almost pure white. Sharp-tailed sandpiper is a bird that's been recorded in Clark County several times, and I'm just going to throw this in so we can compare it to pectoral sandpiper, which is what it would be with when it does occur in Clark County. So it's pectoral-like. It's got a rufous cap, which the pectoral sandpiper does not have. It's got rufous-tinged chest and back. Remember, the pectoral sandpiper has that sharp demarcation of the streaks turning into white. This is more of a rufusy tinged bird that is sort of blends into the whitish below, so there's no sharp demarcation. It's got the white supercilium. It also has yellow legs. But this is one of those birds that you really hope to find when you're out there looking at pectoral sandpipers. So there's the comparison of the two of those. Heavily streaked upper chest and versus the rufous wash and the thick yellow base bill versus a dark, thinner bill that the sharp-tailed sandpiper has. And notice also the pectoral sandpiper is that brownish versus the rufous tinged look of the sharp-tailed sandpiper. Sharp-tailed sandpiper is actually an Asian shorebird that gets regularly occurs up in Alaska and some of the outer islands of Alaska. And every year there are reports of sharp-tailed sandpiper down on the mostly west of the Cascades. And since we're west of the Cascades, this could appear at any time of any fall in Clark County. Let's go to the smaller shorebirds now. And this is the dunlin, and I think most people are familiar with dunlin. In the breeding season, it's a no-brainer to figure out what a dunlin looks like. It's got the red back, the upper right photo shows the rufusy back and the black belly, and otherwise very contrasty with the rest of the white underparts. But in the fall and the winter, it can look very, very brown, like the lower right photo indicates, a uniform brown with sort of an off-white below. But they've always got a fairly long, for a small shorebird, slightly drooped black bill. So that's the way that you would be able to identify Dunlin. And in Clark County, as the lower left photo indicates, that photo is taken in a flooded cornfield in spring at Chilapoo Lake, in the spot where all of the corn is growing to the north side of the trail that goes out there. And that's a popular place in spring for concentrations of Dunlin as well as other species of shorebirds. So that's a really good spot to go for when you're looking for shorebirds in spring. And you always hope that the Dunlin that you do see are going to be going into that breeding plumage. So you're going to see the black belly patch as well as the rufous on the back. So let's compare, I'm just going to compare stilt sandpiper and Dunlin because they happen to be both curved billed species. Yellowish green long legs versus shorter black legs, the yellowish green long legs being the stilt sandpiper and the black legs being that of the Dunlin. And the Dunlin seems to have more of like an eye arc kind of look to it as opposed to an eye line. And the eye line is prominent in the stilt sandpiper. And then there's a slight decurve in the stilt sandpiper versus a more noticeable decurved bill on the much smaller Dunlin. Okay, let's get into that area that everyone is pretty much afraid of to look at, and those are the peeps, or the smallest shorebird. So the largest regular winter peep is the western sandpiper. They have a slightly drooped bill. They've got all black legs, and it's very pale below, and the pale approaches going up the shoulder, if you can see that. Western sandpipers can be in a variety of different habitats, mudflats. They can be in flooded cornfields. They are not going to be in super deep water only because their legs are fairly short because they're a small sandpiper. Oftentimes they are in flocks of 50 to 75 or so. So it's a really good shorebird to get to know around here. They don't really winter here very much, but in spring, during spring migration, they can be quite common. Baird sandpiper, on the other hand, this is usually a fall shorebird for us. And one of the things you'll notice with a Baird sandpiper is how long-bodied they look, and that's because they've got long primaries, which really stick out beyond the tail. And that's because most Baird sandpipers winter all the way down in southern South America, all the way down to Tierra del Fuego. So they're going long distances. They're doing long migration paths. So they need those long wings to be able to get them all the way down there. So they're very long-winged look. They've got black legs, like a western sandpiper. They've got a buffy blush. This bird on the left is a fall plumaged, it's a fall bird, and it's a young of the year bird because you can see all of the very scaled back look to it. And it's one of the peeps that I think is most easy to identify. The photo on the right was taken this spring of a Baird sandpiper adult bird in spring, also in the flooded cornfields at Chilapoo Lake. It's quite surprising to see that. I think it's only the second spring Baird sandpiper I've ever seen on the west side of the Cascades, and both of them were literally in the same spot in the same flooded cornfield, maybe 3 years apart from each other. But look for that long, lengthy look of Baird sandpiper. Semi-palmated sandpiper, this is a bird that is sometimes quite difficult to distinguish from western sandpipers, but it can be done. This is a bird that usually appears fairly early in the fall migration, and fall migration of shorebirds actually starts at the beginning of July. So beginning of July is when you start looking for these returning shorebirds. And semi-palmated sandpiper has a habit of showing up fairly early in that fall migration period. They've got black legs, just like Western sandpipers do, but they don't have that longer, droopy looking bill that the Western sandpiper has. They have a more stubby looking bill that is wider, wide based, but short black bill. And it's more grayish tones compared to the Western sandpiper, which is always going to have those rufous scaps that you'll be able to see that really make Western sandpipers pop. Semi-palmated sandpipers, they're just more that gray, dull grayish look. They've got a whiter throat and paler underparts. An adult semi-palmated sandpiper, the lower left photo, I didn't take here. I took in a pond in northeastern Montana this spring, and it's more to show, if you can't see anything else, you're just looking at that stubby black bill, which separates it from the Western sandpiper. So this is not a bird that you're going to run into every day of the week when you're out looking at shorebirds in the fall. I know there's a couple of birders in Clark County who are still looking for semi-palmated sandpiper for the county list, so it's not something you just sort of trip over when you're looking for other things. Least sandpiper, this is the smallest shorebird. They've got yellow legs. It's the only small shorebird with yellow legs. All the other ones that we've been looking at have black legs. They've got a warmer brown tone as opposed to the grayer tones or the more pronounced rufous lines of a Western sandpiper. They still have the pale underparts. Their area that you see them in, they're not going to be wandering around out in the water. They're going to be most likely to be on drier land. They do dabble around a little bit on the edge of the water, but they mostly prefer drier ground as opposed to Western sandpipers, which would be more apt to be feeding in the water or very close to the water. So that's one way that you can separate least sandpiper, just by habitat, as well as by looking at the yellow legs and how small the bird is. It's only 6 inches long, which is much smaller than all of the other shorebirds that are out there. So comparing some of these, here's a comparison of Dunlin to Western sandpiper. Dunlin has that longer, more droopy bill than a Western sandpiper. Both of those photos are of Western sandpiper, and Dunlin is the lower right. And Dunlin is more that uniform brown back as opposed to the rufous and more patterned back of Western sandpiper. And Western sandpiper, you'll notice that white that sort of goes up the side of the shoulders, it looks like. That's another way to, which gives a Western sandpiper a much paler look to it compared to the Dunlin. Okay, least sandpiper versus Western. First thing that really pops out at you is Western sandpiper has the black legs. Lesser and least sandpiper has the yellow legs. So the least sandpiper is the upper right photo, and the lower center photo is lesser yellow legs as well. And this is semi-palmated sandpiper versus Western. And the upper right photo, I don't know if Lynn Topinka is with us tonight, but this is Lynn Topinka's photo of a semi-palmated sandpiper next to a Western sandpiper in the upper right corner there. And it shows some of the marked differences between Western and semi-palmated. Semi-palmated has that shorter, stubbier, wide-based bill with no droop to the bill, and it's got a slight white eye line, and it doesn't have any of the rufous scap feathers that a Western sandpiper is going to have in a fall. So that's one of the ways that you would separate it. Western sandpiper is also larger than a semi-palmated. Best way really to find a semi-palmated sandpiper, I think, is to look at the hotlines, and when someone's reporting a semi-palmated sandpiper at one of the ponds in Clark County or across the bridge into Oregon, go down and see if you can find the semi-palmated based on all of these descriptive characters that we've been talking about here. So least sandpiper and Baird sandpiper, Baird's being the very, very long bird, as opposed to least sandpiper being very short. And I've linked these two together because these two species are more apt to be in the drier vegetation, regardless of the fact that the two Baird sandpiper photos show them in water. They tend to be more in the drier mud sections of areas and along the edges of vegetation. So But these are two species that are very easy to distinguish between each other, because one is 6 inches and the other one's probably, oh, I don't know, 7 inches, maybe 7.5 inches. And one is very long, whereas the other one is quite short. And one of them has yellow legs and the other one has black legs. So Western Sandpiper and Baird's, both of those have the black bill. But again, the Baird Sandpiper has that very, very long look about it. And in the fall, we get most of the Baird Sandpipers we get in Clark County are first-year birds in the fall, and they have a very scalloped, scaled look on the back, which really pops out. And that's a look that a Western Sandpiper and the other peeps are never going to have. And those fall Baird Sandpipers that do show up tend to be a little more on the buffy looking side, which is another distinguishing characteristic of Baird Sandpiper compared to the other peeps that are out there in the fall. I'm throwing in sanderling because sanderlings do occur. They are fairly rare in Clark County. You can go by a couple of years without seeing one, but they do occur and you should be on the lookout for them. They're very, very pale looking, and look at it's a very thick, short, sort of heavy black bill, black legs, very white below and very uniform gray above. They run a lot. If you go out to the beaches on the outer coast, the sanderling is the bird that's, zipping along, feeding on the edge of the surf line. But sanderling is something that I think I've seen maybe 2 or 3 in Clark County. So it's not a bird that you run into every day of the week when you're looking at shorebirds in the fall. But they do occur, so you should be on the lookout for them. They seem to regularly occur at Broughton Beach on the other side of the Columbia, next to the airport. But that's only a mile from Clark County. So sanderling versus Western Sandpiper. Notice how much more pale it is. It's a pale gray as opposed to that more patterned look of the Western Sandpiper. Western Sandpiper has more of noticeable droop in the bill compared to a sanderling. And sanderling, given the fact that the bill is shorter, but it's the same width at the base of the bill compared to a Western, since the bill of the sanderling is shorter, it gives it more of a broader look to the bill compared to a Western Sandpiper. But again, all of these peeps in the sanderling and the Dunlin should be looked for in Clark County in the fall. Now we go to a whole different section of shorebirds, and these are the plovers. And I love to call plovers mud robins. And the reason I do that is because when you look at a killdeer, you look at a semi-palmated plover or a black-bellied plover or any of the species of plovers, the way that they feed is they'll run along and then they'll stop and they'll sort of cock their head, and then all of a sudden they're pulling something out of the ground. What does that remind you of? It reminds me very, very much of the feeding style of a robin. So if you see a shorebird out there that has the feeding behavior of a robin, think of that as mud robin, and those are plovers. There are only about 3 species of plovers that are regularly occurring in Clark County. Golden plovers I threw in here just so you're aware that 2 other species can occur, but those are the killdeer, the one that we all pretty much know, semi-palmated plover, as well as black-bellied plover, and the golden plovers. So killdeer, obviously, I think everyone's probably got one in their neighborhood somewhere or fairly close. I have a couple pairs that are nesting within probably a half a mile of where I live. So it's really nice to hear them at night, with the killdeer call. They got 2 black bands, red eye ring, uniform brown back, and fairly large, long, thick legs. Compared to a semi-palmated plover, which is much smaller. And notice the color of the legs, they're orange. They've got the single black band, and it's got a bicolored short, thick bill and a white band around the neck as well. This is a species that does regularly occur in spring in Clark County as well as in the fall. And they're going to be around in muddy situations more than say, wandering around in the grasses. That's not to say that they're not going to be going around in the grasses, but they're most likely to be occurring on the mudflats. But notice this plover, as well as killdeer, as well as black-bellied plover, how round the head is. So they've got that very, very round-headed look, very much like robins and our thrushes do. So when you compare killdeer and semi-palmated plover, just looking at those two photos, it's sort of obvious the differences. The orange legs, the short stubby bill, the one black band versus the two black bands, and you know, the bicolored bill as opposed to a thicker, heavier, all black bill of the killdeer. And again, it's the killdeer saying killdeer, which they seem to never be able to shut up, which is kind of nice, versus the to-eat call of semi-palmated plover, completely and totally different. The black-bellied plover is, it's a bird in spring when it's in full breeding plumage, is a no-brainer as far as what it is, because it's got that beautiful all black belly with the white line that separates the mottled gray and white and back and crown. That white that separates the black belly from the upper parts. It's got a very, very heavy black bill, fairly short, heavy black bill. Very round head because it's a plover, just like the semi-palmated and the killdeer. When they're flying, as the lower left photo indicates, they've got black wing, what I call wing pits, which are the axillaries. And so when you see shorebirds that, you know, fairly large shorebirds that have that black under the wing, most likely it's black-bellied plovers. The photo on the lower right is probably one of the worst quality photos I've ever put into a presentation, but I just wanted to show you, and so that means it's obviously my photo. This is a black-bellied plover that showed up with about 8 or 9 other black-bellied plovers this spring in the cornfields at Shillapu Lake. So it was quite nice to see that many black-bellied plovers, and some of them were in the basic plumage, like the upper right photo, and some of them were molting into that beautiful crisp look of the breeding plumage or alternate plumage. Golden plovers, there are records of golden plovers in Clark County, both American golden plover and Pacific golden plover. One of the ways that you can tell the species apart is by how gold looking they are. But if you just look at golden plovers and how short and fairly thin the bill is, these birds are slightly smaller than black-bellied plover. And when side by side with a black-bellied plover, you'll notice the eye line of golden plovers, and they've got a more slender, dark bill compared to the thicker, heavier bill of black-bellied plover. But both species of golden plovers do occur in Clark County, but they're fairly rare. Unfortunately, I would love to say that I could see more golden plovers, but that doesn't seem to be the case. There was one, I believe, Pacific golden plover that was seen in this spring at the end of Lower River Road, which was a real nice attractant to a lot of birders who wanted to go and see one of those Pacific golden plovers in Clark County. So here's black-bellied plover alongside golden plovers. So you've got the grayish look of the black-bellied plover as opposed to the warmer golden hues of Pacific golden plover, as well as American golden plover. Habitat golden plovers seem to like being more in the vegetation as opposed to the black-bellied plovers, which tend to be further out in the mud flats or just on the edge of the vegetation. Again, golden plover, unfortunately, in Clark County is, you probably have to be going out there for quite a number of years before you run into a golden plover, which is unfortunate because I really like them. Now let's get on to the big guy shorebirds. And these are the ones where if you see it, it's like, oh, I know what that one is. So you're talking about the American avocet, black-necked stilt. And unfortunately, in this county, Whimbrel and long-billed curlew, they have occurred in this county, but it's not one of those birds that just roll out of bed, get your binoculars and scope and go out and see one. It's something that does not happen very frequently. But when they do, it's just one of those birds that you look at going, I know what that bird is because of that long curved bill. So black-necked stilt, elegant black and white. You can't get more elegant in a shorebird than a black-necked stilt. Those long, black, needle-thin bill and those really, really long legs. I have friends of mine who don't call these black-necked stilts, they call them marsh poodles for obvious reasons. They're just so stunning, and that crisp, clear demarcation between the black and white just makes this a really, really stunning bird to see. Avocets, also stunning, totally and completely different color pattern. They've got the grayish blue legs as opposed to those long, thin red legs, upturned bill, and they've got a unique feeding style where they sort of have, put their head and bill into the water, and they sort of swing that bill back and forth. Very unique among shorebirds. And all of these photos, unfortunately, except the lower left one, don't show that beautiful, I don't know what color you would call that, sort of a golden color on the head. It's absolutely an absolutely gorgeous bird. We were lucky enough to have, I forget whether it was 2 or 3 or even 4 avocets in one of the ponds at the north end of Lower River Road this spring, and they hung out for, I think, 3 or 4 days. So that was a real treat to be able to go up there and see the avocets. They do not occur every year, but it's a species to always look for. Curlew, long-billed curlew, very, very long, a very tall shorebird. These are, if one ever occurs here, and they do occur. I actually had one fly over my house one day in the last 16 years. It's a very large shorebird with that long, slender, decurved bill, and that very sort of tan look. And since they've got that long bill, they've got a unique feeding style where they are able to probe way, way down into the mud to be able to get that food source that is much slower, much further down in the ground compared to what the other shorebirds are able to get to. So they've got their own unique niche as far as the food that they can get compared to other shorebirds. Whimbrel, on the other hand, it's that same decurved bill, but it's a much shorter decurved bill, and as opposed to the plain look that they have on the head, the whimbrel has the dark line through the eye and a dark lines on the cap as well. And they're much grayer compared to the browner hue of the long-billed curlew. But when you compare both of these side by side, it's fairly obvious when you're looking at a curlew, because both of them have that long decurved bill. And they both got, the very long legs as well, so they really stand out amongst other shorebirds. The last shorebirds that we'll talk about are the phalaropes, and we have records of all 3 of these species of phalaropes in Clark County: Wilson's, red-necked, and red. Red phalarope, the lower left, being a pretty rare bird in Clark County, but they have occurred. The Wilsons and the red-necked phalaropes are the phalaropes you're most likely to get in Clark County. This year, we were very, very lucky to have Wilson's phalarope. We were getting something like 4 or 5 or 6 in one pond at the end of Lower River Road this spring, and we all wondered how long they were going to stick around, because I don't believe there are any breeding records of Wilson's phalarope, and it would be really, really, it would have been a coup for us to be able to find Wilson's phalaropes and prove that they were breeding, but I don't think we ever actually found a family group of them. Phalaropes are unique among shorebirds in that the male shorebird, the male phalarope, is duller than the female. So the bird in the upper right, you would think, oh, that's a great photo of a male Wilson's phalarope. That's actually the female. The female obviously lays the egg, and the male comes in and does all the incubation and takes care of everything. So it's sort of a role reversal as far as what the parents are doing. But Wilson's phalarope, an adult breeding female Wilson's phalarope is just an absolutely stunning bird. In the fall, it loses all of that color, and so when you see a bird that looks like the bird in the lower right, a very, very pale looking bird, pale above and pale below, it's still got that long, needle thin black bill That's the way that you're going to distinguish Wilson's phalarope from the other phalaropes. And phalaropes also have a unique feeding style in that they whirl around in the water very, very quickly, going around in a circular motion. And it's like, it's a little whirlpool that they're creating, and that sucks their food up to the surface so they can grab it. So that's Wilson's phalarope, as opposed to redneck phalarope, which we had a good spring for redneck phalaropes also at the end of Lower River Road. We were seeing one pond that both had Wilson's as well as redneck phalaropes on the same pond. So it was a great way to contrast and compare. Redneck phalaropes had that dark ear patch for non-breeding birds, very thin bill, but it's nowhere near as long as the bill of the Wilson's phalarope. They've got that, and they're smaller than red phalaropes. They're also smaller than the Wilson's phalarope as well. And just as with the Wilsons, the male redneck phalarope is slightly duller than the female. So the photo in the upper right has the male redneck phalarope in the foreground and the female in the background. And notice how much more spectacular the colors are on the female compared to the male. Red phalarope, the only time that I think we've ever had red phalarope is after a humongously big storm in the Pacific in the late fall. I think it was November, when a couple of red phalaropes ended up in Clark County. I think it was more than a couple, it was maybe 5 or 10, and in different locations. And for example, Ridgefield National Wildlife Refuge, and I think there were a few on some settling ponds somewhere. But red phalarope is not a bird that you would expect to see here, but in late fall and winter, when you see a phalarope, it's actually more likely to be a red phalarope. And you look for red phalarope in Clark County after a big, huge Pacific storm that has westerly winds that might throw those phalaropes way inland, because that's when you would get them. And unlike the redneck phalarope, which is what this is closely resembling because of the black ear patch, notice that it has an unstriped back as opposed to the redneck phalarope that has the striped back. That's one of the ways that you would separate it. And this is slightly larger than the redneck phalarope as well. It's also got a thicker bill, but this is not as noticeable as the other characteristics like the unstriped gray back and the slightly larger look of them. So I think that's all we have for the shorebirds. And in summary, when you're doing shorebirds in Clark County, it's really good to know where to go to look for the shorebirds, know where those large ponds are that tend to have a little bit of mud exposed around the edges of the water, know where your local settling ponds are, your water retention ponds, because they can be really good for shorebirds. Know how to use eBird as a tool to figure out where other people are seeing shorebirds and what's most likely to occur in whatever month it happens to be that you're planning to go out and look for shorebirds. So eBird is a very useful tool for the where and anticipating what types of shorebirds you're going to see when you go out to those particular locations. And use the following for the identification, and really try to look at the profile of the shorebirds, the habitat that it's feeding in, the size of the shorebird. Is it large, medium, or small? The color, is it brown or gray or black and white? That kind of thing. And also the feeding behavior. Is it running? Is it being robin-like? Is it whirling? Is it stabbing? Those kinds of things. Those are the key features that will help you to figure out what those shorebirds are that you're seeing. Another way to do it is to go out with Cindy McCormack, who always knows what all these shorebirds are, and she'll be able to help you with all of the shorebirds that you're seeing. I would be remiss if I didn't thank a lot of people for the information that I've used in this presentation. The eBird users, of which there are, thousands and thousands of eBird users out there, all entering their sightings onto one shared database, which allows all of us to be able to pluck out information that will help us to see the birds that we're looking for. A lot of the photographs are not mine. The photographs that were taken, the reason why they're so good is because they're being taken by other people. For example, my brother, Mike Danzenbaker, who is an incredible photographer. Greg Johnson, who I believe is listening in, is a really gifted photographer who lives in Battleground. And I believe one of the solitary sandpiper photos from the retention pond was his. Maxine Reed, who lives up north of Seattle. Of course, everything north of Seattle is just, I don't know what the towns are there, but she has really, really good photos. Our own Lynn Topinka has some incredible photos. She's also a very gifted photographer that I think we have. Dave Irons, who lives in Beaverton, shared some of his photos. And then there are many, many other photographers out there who also have a wide range of excellent photos of shorebirds as well as other birds out there. Also want to thank Vancouver Audubon for allowing me to present all of these information and share shorebirds with you, and also the Washington Ornithological Society. And I thank them because the first shorebird presentation I gave for West Coast shorebirds was for one of the Washington Ornithological Society conferences. I think it was in Ocean Shores, and I gave a workshop on shorebirds. So I at least had most of the presentation ready to go and had to make obvious Clark County modifications so that I could do this presentation for you tonight. So now it's up to you. Go out and identify those shorebirds. And Don, that's all I've got. Do I do a stop?
Thank you, Jim. No. Does anybody have any questions? You can put questions in the chat box if you want some clarification on any of those really fine comparisons that Jim did. Really an excellent presentation. I appreciate that, Jim. This is going to be on our Facebook page, so people in Vancouver Audubon or anybody can go back in there and what were the differences between some of this different birds. You can go back in there and check again. It'll be on our Facebook page.
Fantastic, good.
But if there's questions that anybody has, this is your opportunity to ask Jim directly. There are no open questions, just getting some great program comments and thanks. So it looks like there are no questions. Jim, I thought that was an excellent presentation, excellent photos, and that is just great to see.
Well, I appreciate that. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for the work that you did putting into that. So with that, I guess we will call it a night, and I'm going to end the recording.
Do I do a stop share?
Yeah, you can stop your share.
Okay.
And I guess we can just leave the program. Thank you, everybody, for attending.